everybody. We're just gonna wait to let lots of people in the room.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Okay, we're just gonna wait one more minute. I hope wherever you are, you're doing well today. Okay, wait about 20 more seconds and then we'll start. Okay. Good morning. My name is Susan Aronson, and I am Director of the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub at the George Washington University in Crazy Land. And I'd like to welcome you to our 55th webinar, which we're very proud of. Um, and we're very grateful to our co-organizers at the NSF NIST Trustworthy AI Institute, the GWTAI Trustworthy AI Initiative, today the Center for Democracy and Technology, etc. And so today we are really privileged to have two very thoughtful speakers. We have Miranda Bogen, who's the director of CDT, Center for Democracy and Technology's AI Governance Lab, which, and she's written a very, very interesting paper with a colleague, and she'll talk about that. And then our discussion is Matthew Reisman, who's the Vice President of U.S. Policy at the Future of Privacy Forum. So we're going to begin with Miranda. Please take it away, and thank you so much for coming.
Sure. Thank you all for coming and for being interested in this topic. Um, just as a bit of personal background of kind of how I came to this topic, I've been working in the AI and tech space for about a decade, for a few years working alongside the civil rights community, thinking a lot about algorithmic discrimination and the role that data can play, not just that it's collected, but what happens once it's used and how it can shape people's experiences online. Then I worked in industry for a while and kind of saw it from the inside, working with teams building foundation models and AI systems of all types. And now, as Susan mentioned, I run the AI governance lab at CDT, where we think about what are sort of actionable recommendations for the effective governance of AI. And that includes recommendations to developers, to policymakers, to researchers, et cetera. So in my experience, a lot of the conversation around AI, at least for some time recently, when it's come to foundation models, has been around obviously the outputs and the quality of those outputs, hallucinations, biases, safety issues, et cetera, and the training data of those models, scraped from the internet, just volumes and volumes of data, trillions of data points, which is, obviously a very important part of the equation. But as these what had once been research projects have become commercialized consumer products and business products, I was starting to see examples of ways in which the companies who are making these products available were starting to add the ability for these tools to start to remember things about their users. Now, at first, really anyone interacting with one of these models would get, certainly not the same output for the same input, because they're stochastic. There's some randomness built into how these models generate outputs, but not necessarily dramatically divergent based on the individual and accumulations of their own data. It was really just what was included in the prompt, and which can be very, very long, and that kind of shaped the output. But now these platforms have been starting to collect chat transcripts to extract factoids about people with the goal of making the tools more helpful, right? To making the outputs more salient or relevant to the people using them, without requiring them to include every piece of context that was necessary in their own prompt, which was both, it took a little bit of work and also wasn't necessarily leading to the outcomes people thought. So that got my colleagues and I thinking about how are the ways in which these systems are becoming personalized that maybe we're not tracking yet. So we did some work on that a year or two ago, to solve the different parts of these products, from the account level to the chats themselves to kind of technical choices that could be made that might shape how the outputs of the models would be customized on an individual basis. And in thinking about that, we realized that this is all still quite nascent, unlike sort of the many decades of conversations about privacy that we've thought about in the context of social media and online platforms. The way that that some of these newer companies were shaping their personalized experiences was still experimental, somewhat early, and there's still an opportunity to kind of shape the norms around it. So we held a workshop that was supported by Microsoft's Office of Responsible AI. We had a number of academics join, experts in privacy, data governance, AI personalization, and really thought through what are the concerns that memory-enabled AI present? How closely do those resemble the same concerns that are more familiar in the context of privacy? And what might be development choices, architectural choices of these models and the systems that surround them that could be made today that would help stave off the most obvious harms, and build the foundation for making better choices, whether now or down the line, depending on when we all realize that this is important enough to mobilize around. So in the report, we kind of go through some of those same concerns. Similar themes came up around how do users know what information is being collected, stored, inferred, assumed about them, and how can they control that? But knowing that there's so much going on, notice and consent is not, it's probably a brittle structure for this world. Thinking about bias and discrimination and assumptions that might be made based on data collected about people. Thinking about the impact of personalization on the ability to even measure how these systems are functioning from a safety perspective. This is a challenge, of course, that's come up in social media and online spaces around researcher access, but it also really challenges how AI researchers think about safety, where they've mostly been probing models and measuring outputs to map against benchmarks and evaluations. And the behavior of models under those conditions is likely to change dramatically if models are also incorporating individual level memory, for instance. So we lay all that out and we make a number of recommendations about some of the architectural choices that I think we'll talk about in the discussion. But largely, I think the key learning we had and the key takeaway is that some of these AI memory systems, what they basically do is, unlike sort of databases of previous world, they are dumping all of the information into kind of one puddle, right? Everything is context for a model, and when everything is raw text in context, that makes it really difficult to prevent certain information from being used in circumstances where it's not appropriate. And to kind of put guardrails around topics that maybe you might want to draw a boundary around for other purposes. The architecture just currently isn't conducive to the way we've traditionally thought about purpose limitation, controls around data use, things like that. And so I think one of our primary recommendations is just that we should be building architecture for these systems that accommodates the resegmentation of data in some way so that we don't end up needing to untangle a huge mess down the line when everyone's data is just in one giant blob and the developers realize that that's actually not permitted, acceptable, desirable, et cetera. And we're starting to see some examples of companies exploring that, like having little, separate projects that have memory just within that project. Or we saw ChatGPT and Claude introduce health specific areas that have some sort of different commitments around data. So we're starting to see some examples of this, but still a long way to go. And more detail in the report. I'll stop there, and I know Matthew and I are going to have a chat and go into detail, and we'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you so much. And Susan, Michael, thanks so much for having me. And it's a real honor to be here with you, and also Miranda, to have this chance to talk with you, because this is really, for those who haven't had a chance to sit down and read the paper, definitely do that before your day ends, because it's a great read. I just want to say that this is a vital contribution. I don't know about you all, but it seems that every day it grows more timely as our interactions with these tools accelerate, as their development accelerates. And I really thought the report did an excellent job of kind of mapping the technical foundational dimensions of memory. Miranda, you talk about three concepts that I'd sort of like to unpack a bit. You talk about object, you talk about form, and you talk about time. And then you talk about why choices across each of those dimensions have profound implications for privacy and other aspects of user experience that matter. So let's dive in on those. Let's turn to form first. And I really wanted to go to, in the paper, you talk a lot about parametric versus non-parametric memory. You make clear that those distinctions are important. For those of us for whom that vocabulary is new, can you help us understand what the difference is between parametric and non-parametric memory, and why it matters? What are the implications associated with each?
Yeah, so for those following conversations around foundation models, you've heard talk about billions of parameters, this, trillions of parameters, that. That's kind of one of the key characteristics of models, is how many parameters they have. And the parameters are basically the weights that make up how the model behaves, right? The numbers that determine how it's relating word bits to other word bits. And so parametric updates basically mean updating those parameters, updating the model itself. And that might be additive. So, fine tuning a model sort of at the margins, or it might be something deeper. There's all sorts of ways that one could update parameters, but it's a very distinct way of absorbing information than having that information be separate in, say, a database that the model could just call on and search, right? So if anyone's heard of methods like retrieval augmented generation, or have used sort of agents that search the web or things like that, the model is not updating itself live to absorb information that it's coming across, whether in a consumer database or a document or on the internet. It's just accessing that information and then putting that information into its context. So it's sort of text, all the text that goes into its input in order to craft its output. And while that does affect the output of the model, it doesn't affect the model itself. And so the reason that distinction is important is that, with several, tens of billions parameter model, updating those parameters is entirely unexplainable to humans. And so you in order to reverse something that has been remembered, it takes a lot of very different techniques that are not necessarily very effective. So a field in this space called unlearning is trying to remove information from models, whether for safety or privacy or whatnot. It's an emerging field, but it is certainly not reliable to ensure that certain data has been completely removed from model, because this is a deep learning, right? So parametric updates are much more embedded in the model and difficult to explain and difficult to reverse, whereas non-parametric operationalizations of memory are a bit more controllable, in that you can kind of cut off access to a certain field in a database. You can try and put a classifier around the model input or output to say, don't take into account, if it seems like this input contains this information, don't use that, or don't kind of output something that seems to have been based on a sensitive piece of data. Again, not perfect, and that information might still get sort of mixed up with other information in the context window, but it is quite different than the model itself updating from like a governance perspective.
I think you're on mute, Miranda. Sorry.
Sorry, everyone got put on mute all of a sudden. So researchers, AI researchers are definitely actively thinking around what would it look like for models to be adaptable, to be able to update themselves live, to become, highly personalized. And so that could be a direction things end up going in. But for the time being, it seems like most of the implementations of memory in industry are more of the non-parametric variety. That doesn't change that there could be highly impactful, but we're not quite at the more complicated version of it yet.
So I'm going to ask some questions that might veer towards gross oversimplification. So we'll see if you can correct me, because it seems like one might extrapolate from that perhaps, is it fair to say that non-parametric memory is more privacy protective? Yes or no? But also, is there a performance trade-off between sort of parametric and non-parametric?
That's our hypothesis, right? That was sort of where we landed, was that at least at the moment, given where we are now, given even with non-parametric memory, how much complexity there might be in separating out different sources of information, types of information, and making sure it's only used when appropriate, that parametric memory would be even harder to do that with. And so it seemed premature for that to be the practices that are adopted given the open questions. But we'll see. I do think there will certainly be a perception of performance trade-off, and it could be that there is a performance trade-off, and performance trade-off is not like, I wouldn't put those entirely at odds, right? It might actually be preferred for someone from a safety or well-being perspective that a model actually takes into account information about their health condition, their financial status, things like that, in a way, because if they don't take it into account, it could make recommendations that are actually dangerous. Like if a model is providing information about meal planning and it doesn't take into account that you're a diabetic, that actually might be something that turns out to be dangerous, and that should be something that, like, people might actually desire that, but at the same time, people wouldn't want that information to go be transmitted to an employer. And right now, all of that, those data points might get jumbled around in the back end, and it's not clear you can guarantee that certain information is only used in one context and not used in another. So it could be the case that more nuanced approaches, maybe parametric approaches, allow for more, judgment, right? These models do have some element of logic that they can employ, that if anyone reads the chain of thought in models, it's not necessarily true to exactly what the model is doing, but it can provide some indication of what might be going on, and you can see that there are choices being made that might make sense. And so it could be the case that models updating themselves would actually be able to navigate some of those nuances in a way that's more effective than today's sort of like binary use data or don't use data rules. But I think we don't know that for sure. And certainly there aren't any kind of baseline expectations around what would need to be the case for that to be a permissible path.
Well, one takeaway I have from what you've just said and from the paper more broadly is there are some challenges here that are new and novel. There are some that have been around a while, and this is the most recent manifestation. In the roadmap, kind of pointing to that, you suggest that a governance layer could define what memories are accessed and for what purposes. There have been scholars talking a long time about contextual integrity for privacy, like Professor Helen Nissenbaum. This notion that different data may be appropriate to share in different contexts. But so as we're looking at what a governance layer should look like, and as model developers and deployers are thinking about how to construct that, what is most important for them to keep in mind to ensure that privacy is respected in a contextually appropriate way?
Yeah, the first thing I think is that there are likely to be like data points, sources of data, themes of data that users are going to want real certainty that they have full knowledge of how that information is being used, and the ability to say, don't use that in a certain context. That expectation alone requires a certain architecture that is not necessarily being implemented in all cases today, right? So at the very least, like some ability to draw a line around a set of data. There might be a broader circle of information that it's not maybe quite, the stakes are maybe not as severe, but we would still want to make sure that data is being used appropriately and not kind of like, as I said, pulled from one context to the other. And that's where it could be interesting. The models themselves might be able to be tuned with some understanding of norms in how data is used, obviously imperfectly, but better than just like a database style, kind of throw all the data into a model and let it predict something about people. You could also put in the same way that companies have classifiers that determine if an output is inappropriate or like trigger it to kind of produce a different version of an output for safety purposes. Something similar might be useful for privacy. One kind of mistake I hear folks making a lot is thinking about these models as like one entity that everything is within, but actually I'm seeing a trend, I'm curious if others are as well, that the sort of central models actually are orchestration agents and the interface to other systems. They're maybe deploying sub agents, they're calling on skills, they're searching external databases, things like that. All of those connection points actually seem like they're opportunities to inject governance in some way, whether there's like README is about don't use this data for these purposes or only use it for these purposes, or permission, functions that could be built into those handoffs within the components of a system. And so it's not just that everything's thrown into one blob necessarily. It's just that when it comes to memory, everything in the chat transcript ends up is searchable to the model. I don't know exactly what the alternative would look like to maybe not store transcripts in quite that same way, or to have conversation level, topics to say this conversation referenced health. And so, it might not be one that you want to kind of pull on for any random circumstance. Like there's a lot of different choices that could be made around that, but it does seem like there are many places within these systems that we could be doing more to start to add a bit of division back into data.
You just pointed out something that I think is really profound for us to think about. I think a lot of us are accustomed to thinking about these models as simply where the user interface is between us, the human, and that thing on our screen. But increasingly, as you say, it is layers of orchestration. And especially as we move to these agentic models, right? We're seeing where there's lots of elements interacting with each other, each of which needs its own governance and maybe boundaries, and also rules about how they're interacting and sharing data with each other. Another area which we might call a greatest hits, but also with new and novel elements, is around sort of this question of notice, choice, and consent versus privacy by design, and the things that we don't leave to the choice of the user, but that we try and bake in from the beginning. Your paper kind of points at this, that there is some element of choice we want to empower folks with, but we also don't want to overwhelm them. Is there, in your mind, some sort of Goldilocks level of just right controls where folks have choice, but they're not overwhelmed by choice?
I don't think I could define the exact Goldilocks circumstance, but it does seem to me, and also to CDT, that certainly notice and choice is insufficient because permissions that people grant end up typically just giving a lot more leeway to the companies to do more than what users expect, and defining exactly what's going to happen is both challenging because companies might not know what they want to do with it, but also if they're doing a whole lot, that's going to be difficult to parse. So on one hand, we can't kind of rely on that. On the other hand, I think people will expect the ability to control certain things. And so I don't think we can kind of completely divorce ourselves from that fact. And so that actually requires architecture that allows for those controls to function. So as an anecdote, when OpenAI and Meta AI were announcing their early memory functionalities, my team was playing around with them. And if anyone's played around, you'll know that what the companies call memory are basically these extracted facts that are in a little dashboard to say, oh, remember I was born in Berkeley, or remember I have a kid, or I remember I don't like peas, or remember not to use emojis. There's a little area, at least there was a couple months ago when we last checked, where you can see those little factoids that were remembered, and you can delete them and say, actually, that's not relevant. That was wrong. And one other detail is, in some cases, if you ask it to remember, that's where it will go. In other cases, you don't have to ask it, and it will still remember. There's like some element of judgment going into what to extract and kind of store in those memories. So in some cases, it's surprising to see things there, and you might want to delete it. In other cases, it's this is no longer relevant. So we were playing around with that and realized that just because you deleted something in there doesn't mean that the product, the model, like actually forgot that thing, because that same information might be in transcripts, in raw transcripts elsewhere, or it might come from data that the same platform has. For example, Meta uses, I believe they announced that they use data from their other platforms to personalize the experience on Meta AI. And so the control that people have over one little kind of component of that actually might be misleading, because it's not actually controlling that information overall. It's just that one factoid in that particular part of the memory ecosystem of that product. And so at the very least, like, if you give users the ability to control things, that should function. And again, the architectural challenges here are that the current approach makes it really hard to do that, because everything really does end up in the chat transcripts in a way that puts everything in one blob.
You're pointing to the importance of, if we're going to have choice, having it not be privacy theater or choice
Yeah.
theater, having it be really meaningful. Let me just ask you two other quick questions, or we'll try to make them quick, because I know we want to give folks the floor. Your paper was the first time I'd ever heard the concept of memory middleware and this notion of portability for memory. It sounded like a fascinating idea in theory, but also with some operational complexities. Can you say a little bit about what you meant by memory middleware?
Yeah, well, there have been conversations for, I want to say more than a decade now, around like tools that allow people to control their data in a way that they weren't being afforded by the fact that companies, a fragmentation of companies was just collecting everything about them. And yet it might be a moment again where that same idea comes back. Like, if like the context is what powers these models, how do you maintain some visibility control over what you want in your context for a model? So it was really just, it's really just the provocation that, we might think about how users can have some more control over that information. And so there's some initiatives around portability, like, can you at least pull your information, your context that you spent a lot of time cultivating with one tool into another, so that it functions at a similar level and there's more ability to switch. Rafi Kirkorian, who's over at Mozilla, just had up a sort of tool that he pulled together that does something like this, where it's basically it allows people to kind of have their own context and then call different models and have the models access their content rather than the other way around. Again, like, questions around who's retaining what information will definitely come up there, but like, the architecture of these tools is changing such that, like, maybe there's a moment again for people to consider how they might be able to keep hold of their information while still taking advantage of the value that these tools provide. And that kind of, I'll cite another paper that we have recently on the business models of these frontier AI companies, because the value propositions are changing with a lot of digital tools in recent years. The value proposition has been, you get access for free in exchange for your data in some way, for advertising, for other sorts of things. Many of these tools now do offer free services, and some are exploring advertising, but many of them are subscription based. And so the value proposition is actually different. There might be much less expectation that if you give data that the company gets to do whatever it wants with that. It actually should probably not. It should probably do what you want with that data if you're paying for that service. And obviously there's a spectrum of how much people are paying, but anyway, it's just an interesting moment to kind of rethink again some of these familiar conversations, but that are kind of popping up in a new technical moment and a new sort of political economy.
I mean, this feels like the next generation of open data, of maybe even digital public infrastructure, a particular instance where we're trying to foster. A final question I'll ask you. Your paper goes into, it really takes us deep on personalization and the role of memory in that. Another element that I think is complementary is one we've been looking at a bit in some of our work at FPF as well, is personality, which I think of as, and we think of as, how does the system present itself to us? Is it friendly? Is it grumpy? Is it formal? Is it casual? Does it take on a particular character? And in fact, a lot of the public policy, I'll call it building energy, has been around that element and the sort of psychological reaction it brings from people. We were talking as we got on the call, you, me, and Susan and Michael, about how children interact with systems is very, and all of us really is influenced by personality. Is there a role for memory on this element as well that we should be considering in terms of potential impacts?
Yeah, well, some of my colleagues are doing some work right now on the question of dark patterns in AI, because I think personality is a vector that could lead people to maybe turn over more data than they expect because they're having an intimate conversation with some human-like sort of companion style purpose, where you might not turn over that same information to a model that has taken on the persona of your boss, right? And so that, I think, really does lay the groundwork for how people understand what they're interacting with. And it also might change, it both might change how people interact with the tools themselves, but also in creating a feedback loop, then how the tools behave, right? And so we're looking at this concept of model drift, where sort of models deviate from their expected behavior over time, or their expected goals. And in some cases, I've seen that some of those personality mirroring circumstances that have played out in some of the psychosis examples are contributing to that sort of drift away from a set of kind of safety norms or other behaviors. And so I think it interplays in the sense of there's a feedback loop that goes on between how people interact, what they share, and then what then gets reflected back to them, and how that moves the model's outputs over time. And you can personify it, or you can think about it as a massive statistical distribution. The deeper you go down, the more weird parts of the distribution you get into, and that's where weird behavior starts popping up. And so very highly idiosyncratic memories, idiosyncratic circumstances might kind of trigger some of those things where it's an out of distribution input and then behavior gets weird.
I could ask you a dozen more questions about this amazing paper, but I do want to pass the floor. Susan, should I transition to you and our audience?
Yeah, let me just say thank you to both. And we're here for you, guests of this webinar. So could you please put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll start to answer them as soon as you put them there. And they can be for Miranda and Matt, or just Miranda, however you want to do it. I thought this was a fabulous discussion, and I want to ask a question. But although I'm glad to see we have at least one question. So I will keep mine very brief. One of the things that we work on is public participation in AI governance. And what I'm hearing both of you say, which I personally find terrifying, is that people have to be, in order to shape memorization, people are going to have to be understanding of how their data might be used and how they might be manipulated. And I just don't think we've educated people enough on these issues for them to participate effectively. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, again, I think that this is echoes concerns that we've had for a long time. Even though it seems like some of the more basic internet platforms present more basic questions, it's not the case. The way they're actually using data behind the scenes is highly complex, often difficult to explain to users, and yet they try, or at least are told to try. And so I don't think it's necessarily hugely different here. It's just that the modality has changed. And I think people maybe don't haven't thought through the ways in which the companies presenting many of these tools are very similar to platforms they've engaged with elsewhere, and they're not necessarily just helpful assistants. And there haven't been as maybe prominent incidents around how that collection of data could end up impacting people for them to kind of relate to, but the challenge remains the same. And I think there's a lot of work for everyone to do in that front. I do think sort of two ideas that kind of came up in the course of our conversations. One is that it could be the case that LLMs offer some ability to do some of that explanation in a way that is very difficult for a centralized company to do at like every level of understanding, right? It's if you sort of have like an explain it like I'm 5, explain it like I'm 12, explain it like I'm a high school student, explain it like I'm an expert. These models can do that. I think the challenge is that, especially considering some of the ways that the FTC has enforced on privacy in the past, those explanations need to be accurate. They can't be misleading. And so that would pose a challenge to leaning into that utility. The second thing is, one of the challenges I think users have had over the years is that in platforms giving so many granular controls, which in theory we want, you get these like screens and screens and screens and sub menus of all these different options that are so overwhelming that it's very difficult for an ordinary user to make an educated take on what controls they want to exert. You could theoretically, again, more easily interact with a language model mediated tool to say, in general, I don't want this and always do this, and what are you doing with this data, which would be so much easier than all of these different menus. However, one of the challenges there is a security one, which is prompt injection attacks. If someone can kind of easily hijack an AI system based on just a prompt, which is currently the case, and we were seeing that with some of these agentic tools, and someone then, an external party, can use the interface to change your privacy settings, that's a huge risk. And so maybe you don't want your privacy settings to be available through that interface from a security standpoint. So again, the like affordance this might provide, it's currently, I think, not one that we can deploy confidently. And so those two problems could be interesting to try and solve.
But you just made my point, which is that people don't understand the complexity of these issues. Who's supposed to educate them for that? Like right now in the United States, there are ad hoc programs like Trails has one with high school students in Maryland, but it's not part of any state's real curriculum now. Matt, did you want to add anything on this?
Yeah, I think what I'd say, Susan, I would acknowledge the depth of the question you've asked, and I think concern is a fair word to use. Where I see encouragement, I feel like the public conversation around some technologies that have preceded AI, for example, social media, has grown in sophistication substantially from even a few years ago. Even when I talk with my teens about understanding how technologies work and interact with them and may influence them, it's light years ahead of where I think the public conversation was a few years ago. And I think part of it is trying to make this something that is part of school curriculum, like you said, and building out those experiments. In some jurisdictions around the world, right, they've actually called for making AI literacy a requirement. And I think it's very interesting to see how that's operationalized and if that's something to build upon more broadly and to include these sorts of questions in exactly that.
Yeah, that's true. Finland, a couple other countries have done that. Thank you for making that point. Okay, it's time for audience questions, and please continue to put your Q&A in the Q&A. So, Monica has a question. Are the effects of memory way too complicated to allow legislatures to try to set norms? Should technical bodies set norms? Who could?
I don't think that they're too complicated to govern in the same way as, civil rights laws govern outcomes, they don't govern process. I think that it is the policymakers' role to articulate the hard lines and expectations and requirements around what comes to pass And it's the company's job to figure out how to make that happen. And if there are things that are like entirely impossible, there are tools to handle that. Best effort, right? Using the best available science, reasonable effort, right? Like even thinking with the right to be forgotten, it's not like a um, like clear cut requirement that the data that people request to be forgotten is deleted and never exists anymore, right? It is like Google will make the best effort over within a reasonable period of time, and they don't delete that information; they suppress it in a certain way, right? So there's all sorts of different ways that you might operationalize expectations from policymakers, some of which might be more effective than others, and we'll deliberate about that. But I don't think that policymakers need to know exactly how this is all working to know what it is that they would like to not see. I think the problem right now in the U.S. is that we haven't even tried, or we've tried and we've continued to fail with federal privacy laws. And I think the debate around the consensus there is exactly the one that we're going to need now. The stakes are changed, the architectures are changed, but I don't think the values that we're all deliberating will change. People's own choices around the trade-offs they might make might change because they might see these tools to be valuable in a different way than other commercial tools. But that's, I don't think, as intractable a problem as it can be made out to be.
The only things I might add to that, and I strongly agree with the thrust of Miranda's comment, is that there are many domains of public policy, right, where we don't expect for lawmakers to write the details of regulation, but set the broad policy goals, and then in a properly functioning system, right, executive agencies may be set to write the regs, but there can be a role where lawmakers empower technical bodies to do the great work they can do. And we saw this, right, at times where NIST had a role, and we've had at times bipartisan support for the AI Safety Institute to do some of these things. So I think there can be a role where technical bodies work hand in hand with legislators. There's also, in a world where we may not have the legislation happening as fast as one might think is optimal, where companies work together to do some of the standard settings. And you see some really interesting elements of this. For example, a number of the labs working in things like ML Commons. It's a group where they come together and they try and develop some standards that they themselves agree on. And so strong vote for standards and technical bodies, but perhaps working in concert with legislators.
Thank you both for that answer. Okay, next question. There are a number of efforts to standardize how IP protected data should be handled by models. Could we imagine we might find similar standards that signal user preference on memory? We could think of the way Creative Commons tried to address the way user-generated content could be used. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a very astute observation. And I do think that there's a lot in common right now with questions of creativity and copyright and questions of privacy. It's like, to what extent is the information that people have generated permissible to be accessed and used for different purposes, whether that's training a model or improving the model or processing on your own behalf. And so for those same reasons, from the IP side has been so far, again, like largely focused on the training side. And so the interventions there, people are considering are headers, like website headers, LLM.text. There's some conversations in the standards bodies there around guidance, at least on how web-based information can and should be used. I think that the difference, like for both privacy and IP and copyright here, is whether this is information that's available publicly or kind of broadly versus information that's directly provided by a user within their own account area. And the expectations, might end up being different. I won't put a normative label on that at the moment, but one could imagine that there's some difference in how that's implemented. But in either way, you do need some kind of indication of whether information should, must, shouldn't, never like be used. And so the architecture, like I think we in this paper we make a recommendation around memory metadata, like when was it collected? Are there permissions related to it that need to be either considered or respected? And that requires kind of architectural choices right now.
Only thing I might add, and again, strongly agree with Miranda, is I feel like not only is this something we ought to try, but we really need to try, because I think that kind of Susan, as you were pointing to, people are grappling to understand these systems. They need all the help they can get to understand in a standardized way how these things function, what they do with their data. I love the notion of almost nutrition labels in one sense for what these systems do and don't do. And it's good for that information to be conveyed in standardized ways.
The only thing is that standardized, I mean, if I may state my opinion, and Matt, you and I have done a lot of work on trade agreements, and standards process is really undemocratic. It is the people who can afford to go to the meetings to shape the standards. And so this does worry me a little bit, but the outcome might be just great.
Well, you point to the need to, that's a great point, an important point, and one where therefore there has to be a very deliberate effort, I think, an intentional effort to have a diversity of voices that are informing those standards and not only being the ones who can afford the plane tickets and the bandwidth to do.
And I think standards will become even more important on this question, in particular around privacy and kind of the transacting of data, because and this has always happened behind the scenes of like data processors and things like that. Like data is moving hands, but as these tools again become not just interactive tools but agentic ones, the whole point is that they're calling external tools, pushing data so that people can from within one interface interact with a variety of service providers, pieces of information, et cetera. And we're looking into this as well. It seems to me that the current protocols for how information kind of moves between tools at this moment are highly underdeveloped, especially when it comes to data that you might not want to move freely or that might have some kind of restriction. And so I think there'll be an interest, an incentive to develop more standardized expectations around that, because a lot of organizations' trust will be at stake. Even if they're not the kind of front entrance that people are interacting with, they don't want their users' data kind of floating around the internet. And so I imagine we'll see more conversation about this.
Thank you so much for those answers. I encourage more questions in the chat. We have one more that's open, which was kind of answered. How would the right to be forgotten or right to erasure with parametric memory work with parametric memory? I think you answered that a bit, but
I
do you
did.
want to elaborate?
Yeah, and I just shared a paper in the chat that I participated in that was at NeurIPS this past year, where we looked into that exact question, which is there's a lot of assumptions around what technical approaches called unlearning can do for both copyright and privacy. And the point of the paper was to identify what it can do and what it can't do. And so that would unlearning we talk about as kind of the umbrella term for any method that's trying to edit models directly to remove information from them. So like there is active research in that area. I think is not I wouldn't say it's particularly comprehensively reliable at the moment, although there could be a path for some amount of that to go towards complying with that sort of thing, but we don't know yet. And the paper goes into a lot more detail on that. It was a really great paper that involved computer scientists, legal scholars, policy folks. And so the whole point was to try and map some of the requirements that we would be aware of from both a copyright and a privacy perspective to what is known about the technical methods that folks are getting really excited about and often making claims that unlearning could solve for right to be forgotten or kind of removing copyrightable characters or styles or things like that. And we tried to tease that out in this paper.
Thank you. Okay, I think you answered this question to some degree, but the question is, when we give information to an AI system, does it change the model just for us, or does it use our information to improve the model?
Um, all all or some of the above, so in different ways. And so when you provide context to a model, when you submit a prompt or you upload a document, in that moment, it's the output is only changing for you, and it's not even updating the model for you. Although again, that's what I was talking about. Parametric updates would mean that the model itself was like updating itself so that in its future interactions it would kind of take that into account. Right now, that's typically not what's happening. It's just using the information you provided as part of the prompt, and then that's shaping the response. So your uploading wouldn't change the output for other people in that kind of moment. Most, if not all, of the frontier AI companies have given themselves permission via terms of service updates or consent experiences for them to train models using data that users provide. In that case, that information will eventually, if not already, go into training new versions of the model or updating the model or like going into kind of safety training or capabilities training of the model, in which case that information could go into changing other people's outputs based on your information. Now there's a question, or there's not currently a great way to ascertain to what extent there will be risk of privacy leakage from doing that. That's been the concern with the pre-training of like the trillions of data points on the internet, that the model might memorize personal details about someone and then reveal that information when it's not supposed to. That same concern is likely to be relevant when training on user data, and perhaps even more so because it's data that people maybe act as if it's just their own data that isn't going anywhere, but it might not be the case. And so it is likely to change models, but not immediately. Over time, again, that might change as companies explore different architectures and figure out how to operationalize their desire to personalize models. There's, I've heard conversations around federated models where maybe like the data doesn't go into a central pool to retrain a model, but like bits of the model get retrained at the edge and then get consolidated, or even on-device processing in models. All sorts of different ways people are trying to think about how to navigate the privacy issues of training on personal data. But right now, that's my understanding of how it works, is just kind of direct responses to you, and then eventually retraining of models that everyone would interact with.
Has it been a study? Oh, Matt, you were going to say something? I'm sorry.
Just a quick add-on to that. Miranda, correct me if I'm wrong, but this gets back to Susan's point about sort of education of the user. For some providers, they make different guarantees around that depending on what you buy, right? Like if it's an enterprise grade subscription to a certain model service, they may make certain promises about what isn't used for training.
Mm-hmm.
Consumer version of the same tool might have a different set of promises or not.
Mm-hmm. And even within a consumer version, for example, those health specific areas I mentioned, the two examples, if I'm not mistaken, make commitments that data will not be used to train future models. And so would that suggest that other data will? And it also requires users to remember to use that area to engage on a sensitive topic that they might forget later on. What about financial data? What about work data? Like there's all sorts of ways in which that's a very limited approach. But I do think like at least designated areas that people can engage with confidence that their data won't go to update a model seems like it will be necessary, again, like sort of necessary but not sufficient as a privacy intervention. And I think you were asking, Susan, whether there had been any studies about presumably whether training models on personal data would risk leaking that data.
Well, I was going to ask a different question, but okay. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I mean, yes. Lots of studies on sort of memorization and sort of model extraction, the ability to kind of extract data from models, even if it doesn't come out immediately. There's absolutely a risk. I think open question as to what interventions are most effective in preventing that, and how likely would it have to be, or how unlikely would it have to be to feel confident that the resulting model was safe to release given that risk.
Okay, and here's the thing though, as a consumer, it's very difficult for me to differentiate, right? So here I am making decisions. Do I rely on the freemium version of Claude versus ChatGPT, let's say as example, or DeepSeek, where to make this decision, right, is not just a decision about um, which model works best for my needs, which can go from composing a bedtime story for a child to analyzing, creating a table for me comparing US digital trade policy under Trump with under Bush. Okay. There's so much that is opaque, and yet a label cannot give this information. Digital public goods cannot give this information. And I just think about the Nature article by DeepSeek, which said very little about its underlying data set. And then it was, this Korean government found that it lied. Like I can't trust anything from this, and yet more and more people are using these models. So someone here asked, what are governments doing on this front? And really, what can we do?
Yeah, I mean, on sort of disclosing what data even went into the model in the first place, the state of play is abysmal. Even I think under the EU AI Act kind of code of practice, there's some disclosure norms that have been set, and under I think California SB 53, I can't remember, I think has some element of that. The practices are still like we train on a lot of internet data and some data that we collected. Like it doesn't actually tell you anything more than we really knew before. And so there's a long way to go there. I think an argument that has been made is that that's intellectual property, the sort of makeup of the training data, which like challenges the ability to know about it. But again, even for an end user, knowing what data went into a model, I don't think is necessarily the only indication of whether that model or the provider of it has been thoughtful about privacy or safety or will with your data, right? Could have trained on entirely kosher data, right? Like hand selected farm to table data, and it could still collect yours and do something with it that you don't expect. And so I do think that this is outside of my expertise on like how do you communicate with people about privacy, but I do think folks who think about that hopefully are already and certainly if more should be thinking about how do some of their research and studies change in light of the new modalities and the new capabilities that these tools offer and people's expectations of them. Have they changed? But in general, I like my gut instinct would be the free version is always likely to be the least privacy protective, and certainly for the platforms that are also running ads, the ones that are you're paying for a service, I think have a little bit more of, at the very least, the brand concern that if they do something that you wouldn't expect, that you'll stop paying them, and that's where their money is coming from is your
Right.
account. And so those are not mutually exclusive business models. For example, like Instacart was both a subscription and had ads all over the place, still does, right? And now that, the CEO of that company is now at OpenAI and they're introducing ads. So just because you're on a paid plan doesn't mean that they're not also thinking around about how to monetize data that you've provided. But there's a spectrum there, and when you're not, is the adage, when you're not paying, right, you're the product. I think holds here as much as it does anywhere else. But again, the privacy issues related to advertising are not the only privacy issues that are raised by AI tools, especially if they start, connecting to so many things that people are engaged in the world. This has been a long-standing concern around automated decision making, and I think the concerns are now, really coming to pass in a way that folks were yelling about in the past, but now, with models of a different type than they anticipated. We're not just talking about predictive AI, we're talking about generative AI that's being plugged into all sorts of different tools that could be used to make decisions and predictions, but that's not how people are experiencing the tools. So it's a slightly different twist on concerns we've had for a long time around discrimination and the outcomes of data use. But I think that's where we are now. Data use, security issues, all these similar themes, but in a new format.
But It is more complex, I'd argue, and that requires so much more of the user. Okay, 30 seconds to say what you're going to do next about this. What are you going to research next?
Oh, that's a good question. There's so many directions we could go. I would like to better understand how personalization affects the measurement of models at all for any question of safety, whether that's like a privacy related one, something, or other types of harms. Because I think we barely can measure models to begin with now. The science is quite shaky, and there's a lot of understanding that validity needs to be a top priority. But that's when you're not thinking about personalization. Personalization just adds a whole lot more complexity into what you even need to look for. So that's something I hope that we'll dig into a little bit, or at least would love to connect with others who are thinking about that. And then CDT overall, always advocating for, federal privacy legislation, baseline protections. We still will do that. We hope that kind of comes back around because it's certainly as urgent as ever.
Thank you. Matt, do you want to add anything?
Simply add, I know we're at time. I will return back to the point that Miranda made about orchestration and layers. I think a lot of our work will be looking at that, this question of how these questions of privacy change when it's not just you interacting with the model, but the model interacting with other models and agents, and how you build an architecture that inspires trust.
Wow. Thank you, guys. This is fabulous. And thank you to our audience. Our next webinar will likely be on an update on digital trade and implications for AI, and with Stephanie Honey. We look forward to seeing you next month. And thank you so much to our speakers. Please join me in bowing and saluting. And we really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Hey, Miranda, can I have 1 minute of your time? Whoops. Oh, well, Matt, thank you. That was fabulous. You did a